duty of Western liberal democracies to make sure that territories in which they're disseminating both military and developmental aid are not responsible for the suppression of minority rights, are not complicit in discrimination on the basis of your gender, are not impediments to in the way of the freedom of press and the freedom of speech, and religious freedom is present on their territories, ladies and gentlemen. And that is the stance that OG is going to be running in this debate. We're not going to be showing to you, and we don't think it's reasonable to expect any government team to prove to you that by cutting off all kinds of this trade, all kinds of this aid, that all forms of human rights abuses will cease to exist. Rather, we are going to prove to you why it's the duty of a Western liberal democracy to make sure that they're not complicit in this, they're not facilitating these human rights abuses, and at the same time, they're not ignorant of what's happening in the places where they're disseminating this aid. For that, we must understand what a Western liberal democracy is and what kind of values does it stand for, ladies and gentlemen. The first thing we need to understand is that these Western liberal democracies are countries like the United States, countries like the United Kingdom, countries like France. No, thank you, Abbas. But let's understand what are the values that these countries are espousing for. These countries, constitutionally and generally in terms of the values espoused within their own territories, are advocating for people that reside within their territories to become the best version of themselves. This is through facilitating these very rights that I talked to you about previously. And we think at opening government that it is hypocritical of these countries when they decide that it is okay for these practices to happen and for them to be financing these practices at the same time using developmental or military aid at the end of the day. Why is that problematic, ladies and gentlemen? It is problematic because principally, I'll actually take you in a minute, Abbas, because principally these states are expounding such values on their own territories and backing something that's quite opposite to it on other territory. I'll take you, Abbas.
If gender is your metric to decide whether you want to give aid to particular countries or not, then would you have aid not being given to particularly almost any country, especially Islamic country?
No, because there's a difference between the state being complicit in discrimination against transgendered individuals, against women, and generally societies being patriarchal at large. There's a distinction between that. It is when the state actively blocks things like the Women's Protection Bill to happen in the first place. Those are the kinds of countries that we want to punish in the first place by cutting off this kinds of aid. Not all patriarchal societies have state structures that aren't conducive towards women in the first place. But if it means that we're going to be blocking aid from all Islamic countries, so be it. We're perfectly fine with that. We're going to, as part of our case, let's understand a few things. We must understand the kinds of aid that these countries are disseminating through these through international platforms. The first thing, as far as this goes, they've given a backing to certain countries as a consequence of providing them with this aid, because alongside the military and political and the military and economic aid that is given to these countries comes a big letter of endorsement. We're talking particularly about countries like Israel, because when the United States of America, through its vast amounts of military and developmental aid, no thank you, backs Israel on these forums, we think that this does two things. The first thing it does, ladies and gentlemen, is that it makes sure that the United States political cloud is firmly behind countries like Israel. No thank you, Harish. The problem with that is that even when someone tries to hold them accountable on an international platform, say for example the United Nations, they have to deal with the same political backing that the United States is offering to these countries over here to begin with. We think this is extremely problematic, and this hampers with the process of you trying to hold these countries accountable in the first place. No, thank you, Iqbal. But let's understand the other explicit dynamics of the nature of this aid. Firstly, in terms of military aid, let's understand why this is particularly problematic if countries like the United States continue to finance the militaries of countries that actively oppress their people. Why is this problematic? Let's understand this. The kind of states that we're talking to you about are states exactly like Pakistan, post-colonial states where the militaries are extremely powerful. And why is it problematic when you finance wars over here by giving them copious amounts of military aid over here to begin with? When you give the military the kind of strength by actively financing it, you are in essence fueling a military-industrial complex over here. Why does this military-industrial complex facilitate in the abuses of human rights that occur over here, ladies and gentlemen? Firstly, because in terms of the military being powerful and in terms of a warmongering narrative being literally sold as a result of this military aid over here to begin with. The problem that is inculcates over here, ladies and gentlemen, is that democratic institutions become particularly weak compared to civilian institutions. We see this happening quite literally in Pakistan as a consequence of this. Even if the impact of this is intangible to say the best, you are still endorsing the military for all of its actions that it's taking against democratic institutions over here. And we think this results in people not being able to speak out against the military in these territories to begin with. And we think you are complicit in this when you do this, ladies and gentlemen. But moreover, let's talk about developmental aid in particular and why that's really problematic as a result of this. Developmental aid, ladies and gentlemen, does two things. What kinds of things are we talking to you about here? We're talking about, say, US aid funding things for women empowerment in Pakistan, or say, for example, giving people educational opportunities that the state isn't doing. This is two things. The first thing it does is that it covers the steps of the government and fulfills the role that the state is not fulfilling in these countries and states, ladies and gentlemen. What does this do? This prevents the natural course of the re-election incentive being fulfilled and people holding them accountable in these territories to begin with. Why is this problematic? Let's understand this. In Pakistan, for example, if USA wasn't providing the same kind of opportunities to young people, we think dissatisfied young people in large quantities is a place where you actively hold the government more accountable than you are under status quo. If anything, you are preventing something like the Arab Spring from happening in Pakistan when you make sure that these people are content with what they're getting, which is scraps at best, and that too from somewhere abroad. We don't think governments are going to be held accountable unless or until we understand this process may be harsh, but it is a necessary cost you must take to make sure that democratic institutions become well-functioning in these countries. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, as far as this goes, we think that it also strengthens central governments in terms of their ability and in terms of them not being exposed to strategic overstretch. This allows these countries and these states to further perpetuate these harms because their resources are more or less diversified out over here. We think this is extremely problematic, because we believe in the ideals of the freedom of the press. We don't stand with gender discrimination. We think you are actively being complicit in this, and it is the principle behind which Western liberal democracies were founded in the first place, that you shouldn't actively be complicit in this. And because we're not hypocrites like opening government, I'm extremely proud to propose.
Throughout the course of my speech, I'm going to prove to you why opening opposition will definitely take it over opening government. That means we'll definitely be third in this match. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's move on to some of the things that these guys said. These guys talk about military aid being given to these sorts of regimes. Cool, we're going to make this out. We're going to give you two clarifications for what kind of aid we support and why we support it. One, we're not going to give military aid to countries that are literally killing their own populations. That seems like intuitive. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we also say that if there is lots of corruption in these countries, i.e. people are not getting the help they need, and the intending consequences of the aid are not being met, then we also think that it's legitimate to remove this aid. This debate is not about military aid. This debate is about removing all forms of aid, and we think that they haven't done that in the course of their speech. Firstly, their principal argumentation for as to why, ladies and gentlemen, these countries owe a duty to democratize. We say, fine, even if we concede this, we think that there's also a counter duty on these countries. Because in large part, these countries which are giving aid to post-colonial societies were, please sit down, I think it's a protective minute debating. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that the problem then is that these countries have actively profited off of post-colonial states and have actively undermined development in these states because of the colonial era. We think that they also have a counter duty to then develop, which we think that is going to be removed in their world. Please sit down. What?
If your model disqualifies countries that commit human rights abuse and also nations that are corrupt, which countries are you exactly talking about?
No, our model literally says don't give military aid to those countries, give developmental aid. Bad one. Okay, let's move on to the kinds of arguments we're going to give you. On a comparative exam, we're going to do two kinds of things. One, why this aid is necessary. Please sit down, just said P1. One, why this is going to lead to A, like development, and that's a general benefit. But secondly, we're also going to talk about change, why it's likely to happen in our world and not in theirs. That's what I'm going to propose spending time on. The first thing that I'm going to talk to you about are the two kinds of aid before, right? We for humanitarian aid and developmental aid. Why do we think humanitarian or relief-based aid should be given to these countries? It's quite simple. A, these countries in the event of a crisis or in the event of a natural crisis, for example, have poor healthcare systems, they have less resources, they have inefficient institutions, which means that they cannot help their own people. In these scenarios, ladies and gentlemen, where literally saving the lives of people is the most important thing, we think that you should give humanitarian aid, and that's the first impact that we have. But secondly, and even more importantly, obviously we're not going to ask them to like defend humanitarian aid. The bigger part of the argument is developmental aid, right? And over here we propose two things. One, we think developmental aid is going to be hinged at two things. One, infrastructural development, and secondly, we're also going to talk about why this helps them develop healthcare and educational services. Please sit down. The first thing, ladies and gentlemen, is why do these countries need infrastructural development? And what are the problems that these countries face? Because crucially, these guys didn't contextualize the motion for you, or the guys didn't frame it. First, these countries usually have big populations, which means that they're developing countries, which means also that they have high levels of unemployment generally, and also, ladies and gentlemen, there's lots of inflation, which means, ladies and gentlemen, that the economic conditions of these countries are poor, are bad, and generally lots of people are in a poverty cycle and are poor. Please sit down. The first thing, ladies and gentlemen, we say over here is, what does infrastructural development do? It allows you to create trade routes with other countries, make new markets, for example, specialize in other things. It allows for industrialization to happen. We think generally, ladies and gentlemen, this means that you can create new jobs. We think that side opening government conceded to this when they said that the re-election incentive doesn't exist, because for the re-election incentive to not exist, there needs to be actual development, which means that the government can take credit. The government can only take credit when development happens. We see that this is a tangible benefit because this literally means that lots of people get jobs and they are out of poverty. Their lives are better on the comparative as they were before. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that on the comparative, healthcare services and educational services are better. They have shown you no way, ladies and gentlemen, of development in their model, which means that in countries, ladies and gentlemen, specifically, please sit down, where you do not have good healthcare systems or educational systems, you're not going to have that. But there are two benefits of developing these systems. One, by virtue of developing healthcare services, you're going to save more lives, you're generally going to increase the quality of life of these people. But secondly, we also think that healthcare services are important in terms of not having poverty. So for example, if you have good public healthcare systems, people don't need to use like large sums of money to pay for their healthcare. They don't get into cycles of poverty much. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we also think that if healthcare services are good, your labor force generally can go back to where they were working if they can get treated for their illnesses. Please sit down. The second thing with educational development, and here's where the example of US aid becomes extremely important, especially in the context of LUMS. We say, ladies and gentlemen, educational developmental aid is extremely important because it allows for change in our model. Why? Because ladies and gentlemen, we think that you can create awareness for these people in terms of their political rights, which means that you are much more likely to have democratic processes in these countries. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, you can also have activists or leaders in the future coming up talking about these issues, right? We think that educational development happens in our world. Yes?
How much money that Pakistan received as aid did it spend on healthcare and education?
We don't know, but we can have that stipulation, and here's where I'm going to move on to the dependency argument. We think, ladies and gentlemen, that when you're giving huge amounts of aid to countries, they're generally going to be dependent on you, which means, ladies and gentlemen, that you can have strings attached. So instead of not providing aid at all in the comparative, we are much more likely to have more change, because then you can, as a Western country, force countries like Pakistan to specifically spend some amounts of money in some sectors, as opposed to not spending that money over there at all. That is the comparative in this debate, ladies and gentlemen, not that they don't spend money at all right now. The USA was very effective and it did not allow Pakistan to spend money on its nuclear program in terms of the treaties that they gave you. We think that that's fine and will happen in our model. We are much more likely to have that. Why? Because their economies are dependent on it. Governments do not want populations to rise up against them. In the absence of this aid, they have an incentive to get this aid again and again. Therefore, we will have that in our model. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, there is another interesting thing over here. Why does change on the comparative not happen in their model? For two reasons. One, you right now are assuming that there is no other actor that's willing to step in and give this aid. We think that China is now willing to give this aid, especially given the OBOR project, and especially given its actions in Africa and so on. So once the West is removed, ladies and gentlemen, and its ability to enforce things on these populations is removed, China is going to step in. Why is that harmful? One, China is not democratic. It does not need to have the consent of its people. Therefore, there are going to be less checks and balances. But especially because China is not a democracy, it has no interest in politically developing these states either. The only interest it has is in terms of its own markets. So these states are not only going to get the developmental aid, they are also, ladies and gentlemen, going to keep their political systems as they are, and we think that they are much more likely to have that trade-off. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, assuming that they don't have aid at all, which is their world, why do you still not get change? One, because these countries are extremely effective in blaming the West for the problem as opposed to themselves. Case in point, Iran, Pakistan in the Bhutto era, where you blame the West for your problems. Therefore, the re-election incentive that they're talking about doesn't exist in their world either, because you're going to blame an external force for the kinds of problems you have. These entrenched political parties are still going to exist, and those kinds of harms will still exist. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we also think that in their world, if you don't give aid, there's going to be very bad politics happening in these regions, radical politics. Why? Because these are post-colonial societies, which generally means that, gentlemen, there are fractured populations, ethnic minorities and ethnic majorities, which already have like bad past with each other. Once you do this, and once there's large unemployment, which they have to concede to for their world to work, they are going to blame each other for this problem, which necessarily means that you're going to have some degree of violence and increase in homophobia. On the comparative, we're third.
The problem with Iqbal's speech was not that aid isn't helpful. He didn't prove to us, he did not fail to prove to us that aid isn't going to affect change or aid is not going to bring development. The problem with Iqbal's speech was he refused completely to engage with the problem that Jami had identified in his first speech. He refused to tell us how this aid is essentially going to help rid these people of the human rights violation they currently have to face. He told you that this aid will lead to development, and in some later extensions, he did try to tell you why this development will ultimately lead to either education or healthcare, ending these human rights violations. I'll deal with that later, but the primary problem with Iqbal's speech was that he gave you an economics lecture. He didn't tell you as to why all this healthcare aid or all this education aid you're going to be getting is going to lead to changes in these human rights violations. Let's read what he said. He talked about how if you have healthcare, if you have education, this healthcare is going to save more lives. This education is going to lead to these people being educated, ask for political rights, be aware of their political rights, and things like that. The problem with states which are having these human rights violations is that these states do not prioritize this development and do not prioritize this aid to the areas where these human rights violations are occurring. That is a problem that they're not going to be solved in their model, because this aid is usually given to the central government, and the central government doesn't make decisions like make more schools or make more hospitals in places like Balochistan where they are actively violating the human rights of these populations. So we don't believe, even if in your model you are giving education or you are giving healthcare to these countries, we don't believe that the people who are actually being hurt or actually being affected by human rights violations are going to have access to this healthcare or going to have access to this education. Talk about Israel. Israel is going to prioritize whatever benefits they get through this development to the people or to this part of the population which already is enfranchised, which already is privileged. They are not going to prioritize this all the benefits of what you're talking about to the people who they are doing to these human rights violations. Let's talk about the re-election incentive. So here's where Iqbal misunderstood what Jami talked about in the re-election incentive. Jami talked to you about how the re-election incentive does not exist because this aid is able to substitute the work that the central government is supposed to do for these countries. He talked about how this re-election incentive will not exist because these countries usually blame the West for their problems. So this re-election incentive will not exist in our model. It will exist in our model. You have a prime example for that. Iran, Iran blamed the West for their problem, and they had a revolution, and now they have an active political system which is changing. So we believe that the re-election incentive is likely to exist in our model. He talked about how you can have strings attached to this aid, which will make this aid likely to be spent on education and healthcare, things like that. First off, we tell you that it is never within the interest of the West to have the strings attached to this aid to be spent in healthcare or education. The strings attached to this aid are usually strings attached which have a neoliberal agenda attached behind them. Why do they have a neoliberal agenda behind these strings? Because this neoliberal agenda benefits the West itself. You want more austerity with these strings. You want cuts on education and healthcare. You don't want to spend this sort of aid to, on things like the military or things like actually getting benefits to the vast majority of people. Let's talk about how they had a qualification in the case where they're not going to give aid to countries which are corrupt or not going to give military aid in general. First off, you already have within the status quo mechanism in place where if the aid is generally not reaching the large majority of people because of corruption, these countries already are getting. These countries don't get the aid to begin with. Let's talk about what their substitute and alternative. They believe that if the West does not give this aid, China will give this aid, and China is thus much horrible. First of all, we tell you that China simply does not give aid to begin with. That is not a development strategy that China employs. China can employ development strategies of trade, of building OBOR and investment, but that is different from aid. Moreover, they talk about how China is going to be content with not changing the political systems and how in their model, their political systems in America are essentially going to be changed. First off, if China is content with the political systems in these countries remaining stagnant, then so is the West. You're not solving this problem in your model either. Any one of you.
So, in the first speech, you tell us that as a result of US aid, Pakistan doesn't suffer through an Arab Spring. Given the impact of the Arab Spring, why would that be good?
We tell you that's going to be good in my own positive case where the impact Arab Spring was one of revolution which turned to be very violent. We can tell you that sometimes it does not have to turn into a complete revolution. Sometimes the re-election incentive can work democratically within the own framework. And with that said, let's move on to my own argument. In my own argument, I'll be talking about how this sort of aid defeats local incentives for justice. So understand the fact that once you have a country committing large amounts of human rights violation, the people or the population which is affected by this human rights violation often don't take it lying down. These populations often have an incentive, often have an idea, or often do have movements which are fighting for these people who are suffering from these human rights violations. Take the example of Balochistan. You have the Balochistan Liberation Army there. Take the example of Israel. You have Hamas and all these other organizations there. Yes, these organizations are classified as terrorist organizations, but many a times you do have movements for these people who are suffering from all these human rights violations. We tell you, ladies and gentlemen, that first off, when you are giving this aid to these central governments and when you are giving this aid to these countries, this enfranchises and this empowers these governments to deal with these revolutions and to deal with these movements, often militarily and often violently, because they have an interest to deal with it violently and they have an interest to oppress it. We tell you, once this aid is not given to these countries, we say that these movements will have a better foothold in the political system. They will better be able to bargain for their rights. They will better be able to bargain for the position of the people that they are defending. Thus, that leads to marginal change within our model, because these people, these countries will now be better off. The portion of the population which is now being suppressed will be better off because they have a stronger bargaining power bargaining for them. The Arab Spring is an extreme example of where revolution went wrong, because first of this revolution was supported by external powers on both sides. You had America supporting a dictator and you had Russia or any other country supporting the belligerent powers or whatever. We say that because we don't want aid to be distributed, we don't want external actors interfering within these populations, these revolutions are not going to be very violent, and revolution itself is a very extreme form of this. We say in many countries you do have democratic institutions available there, and this re-election incentive will work better off because these people will be able to access the democratic framework which already exists, because the failures of the government will not be hidden. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that within our model, at the very least, you will have change in the most extreme of circumstances where certain countries depend very heavily on aid. For example, Israel, again, ladies and gentlemen, Israel depends and South Korea have depended very heavily on US aid, Egypt as well. When the US threatens to take away the aid that these countries are getting, ladies and gentlemen, we believe these countries will be forced to change or forced to address the human rights violation that they are undertaking. No change will be seen in their model, because all the benefits we talk about, investment, jobs, roads, trade, whatever, even if it is being done, it will only be done to a certain portion of the population, not the portion of the population which is having to undergo these human rights violations, not the portion of the population which is having to undergo this oppression. In their model, they are not going to achieve any change, and in our model, we are achieving a marginal change, but the very idea as to why this aid should not be given in the first place is because the moral responsibility and the moral duty that these Western powers have to themselves, to their own populations, and to people abroad. And for all those reasons, we urge you to vote for Team.
Am I audible? I'm going to be talking about three things inside my speech. Firstly, which model is actually likely to reduce human rights violations? Secondly, what are the blatant harms of removing aid which they haven't contended with, which are not confined to human rights violations? And thirdly, this question of the moral issue and whether or not they're being hypocrites in doing this, in which I intend to add a couple of more pieces of positive content. So firstly, which model is likely to reduce human rights violations? Their claims are basically threefold. Firstly, they say that because you're going to reduce the legitimacy of the state when you pull aid away from it, as opposed to giving it aid, allowing it to continue maintaining its legitimacy, you're likely to create incentives in which they're going to not commit the same human rights violations they're committing in the status quo. The problem with this is what we identified inside Iqbal's speech, which is that these states are still going to be controlling the narrative of where the economic deprivation of their country is coming from. So if a dictatorial state gets the capacity to say that the reason that the economy is going to shift is actually because the West has withdrawn aid and not because it's committing human rights violations, that the narrative still controlled is going to lead to blame being laid back on the West, not internally, and consequently both the issues of legitimacy and the re-election incentive that they pointed out don't really stand as very powerful or strong arguments. But secondly, they said there's going to be a heavy misuse of this aid and it's going to go to problematic actors like the military. Firstly, we've met out the military. We're not going to discuss military aid within this debate whatsoever. Clarification, yes?
Yes, I'm confused by Iqbal's mechanism here. Are you not going to give, so there's a difference between Myanmar, who's committing an ethnic cleansing, and a state like Egypt, which actually is a dictatorship. So would you just stop giving aid to countries which are run by the military entirely?
We don't want to give aid which is being used for military purposes, basically. So if the aid is being used for things which are not developmental and which are not humanitarian, then basically we see no need to distribute that aid. That's the clarification you need. So back to the argument we're making. The claim they made that was that the aid is going to be misused. We've also identified another point in our mechanism which we think largely deals with this, where we pointed out to you that this sort of aid, if it's not reaching its intended beneficiaries, we're just not going to give the aid whatsoever. We think that not giving the aid because of a moral reason is problematic, but not giving the aid because the aid isn't reaching the people it's supposed to is a perfectly fine reason for not giving it. So misuse isn't really a problem either. However, we think that they've also brought about one further incentive inside Salman's speech about local parties which are trying to create their own forms of change and how this is going to lead marginal change in their model. Firstly, we say that the government is repressive and committing human rights violations is probably stronger than any local party, and this marginal change they're identifying is unlikely to take place. But secondly, we also say that it's very possible for you to give aid to these governments while simultaneously not endorsing them and endorsing the sorts of internal change which are present within these countries. Because we see no reason to assume that giving somebody humanitarian or developmental aid necessarily endorses their politics. We say it's entirely possible for you to publicly not endorse their politics, stand up against them, while simultaneously giving them aid because you recognize that you don't want to suffer the immense human catastrophe which is going to happen otherwise. But what are the reasons we identified for you as to why human rights violations are probably going to intensify in their model? Number one, and this is one which you identified inside Iqbal's speech, in the absence of this aid, you're not going to develop. If you don't develop, you're going to have high rates of inflation, you're going to have high rates of unemployment. When you have large numbers of unemployed and dissatisfied people who are not being catered to by the government within your state, then what's likely to happen is that they're going to be further radicalized and further move towards more violent forms of politics, ergo the Arab Spring. We think what's likely to happen inside a situation like this then is that it's not just going to be that human rights violations by the government are going to be reducing or something. Human rights violations in general in society are going to magnify and increase spectacularly, because then the only actor committing human rights violations won't be the government anymore. Because recognize this, while in the status quo, a stable government which is dictatorial is able to commit human rights violations against groups it does not like. No, it is not. It is simultaneously capable of restricting everybody else's access to violence and committing similar human rights violations. In a situation where the government also does not have the capacity to enforce its will upon the people because it doesn't have any aid, because there's generally mistrust and economic deprivation among the land, then we think human rights violations from all corners of society are likely to emerge. And if human rights violations are what they're opposed to a proposition, then there's no way that they can argue in favor of a situation which is likely to lead to an outbreak of revolutionary violence of the sort which you might have seen characterizing the Arab Spring. Secondly, we also told you that you're likely to achieve change in our model by virtue of the fact that strings are going to be attached, and we can force those strings to include things like reduce human rights violation, focus more on education, focus more on healthcare. Their claim was no, the strings attached are necessarily going to be only about the neoliberal agenda, but identifying inside the motion the political capital necessary for you to say we will completely withdraw all of our aid because we think that what you're doing to your minorities is problematic, we think we can similarly borrow some of that political capital to say we won't withdraw all of our aid, but we will definitely modify and condition our aid on the basis of how you continue behaving. Even though we don't think that this is necessarily enough for these countries to completely stop the sorts of human rights violations they're committing. And this is where I'm going to move on to talk about why we don't think that the mechanism they've identified in terms of incentives to take this aid because of dependency are going to work either. Why? Because the types of countries we're talking about have two dual incentives right now. One is economic development, but the other one is consolidating internal power. We think that repression doesn't take place just because a country wants to repress people. Repression is usually a means of consolidating power within your state. And if you require repression to consolidate power within your state, then simply the threat of losing a certain portion of your GDP is not going to be enough to deter you from using the sort of repressive violence you're using in the status quo. However, we think that if we don't threaten to take away all of the money we're giving them, we are able to some degree regulate and modify their behavior, even if not stop it outright, because we recognize that the reason that these states commit repression is because it's necessary for their own political system, even if it's still very problematic. So that's why on multiple levels we think that human rights violations are not likely to be changed in their model and are still likelier to decrease in our model because of mechanisms like education, etc., etc. No. The second thing I'm talking about is the blatant harms of withdrawing aid. This is something Iqbal already focused on. They haven't really engaged with it. There are harms you can commit to people which are not basically just human rights violations. People can die because they're starving. People can be unemployed for long periods of time. This can lead to all sorts of harms upon your society at large. It's going to lead to economic instability. We think these are harms they've completely failed to engage with at opening government, because what they've been trying to win on is the principle of the Western liberal democracy, which segues me neatly on my third point, which is this moral question. The claim they've made here is that it's basically hypocritical to give up the values of Western liberal democracy which it holds in its own state. We think, firstly, many of these Western liberal democracies are ex-colonial states, so it's not just as if the only duty they have here is to uphold their own moral codes in terms of what's right and wrong in terms of human rights violations. We think there's also a definite moral question of whether or not they deserve to pay these people back in economic terms. So on one level, we see that aid is also conflicting moral justification that they need to contend with. Secondly, we say that when it comes down to questions of morality, certainly it's problematic for lives to be lost inside the third world, but at the same time, we think that there's a higher moral premium to be placed upon saving more lives because people aren't starving. And thirdly, we say even if that isn't a moral question, it is important to give up principles in times where lives can instead be saved. So that moral question doesn't really stand. Now, the final piece of positive analysis I'm going to contribute to this debate on the moral level is going to be about how this is targeting the wrong people. Who does a human rights repression? It's basically states which are incapable of governing through consensus and through majoritarian politics. Why is there no consensus? Because these are frequently sham democracies dominated by elites who come from dynastic political families, or they've set up some sort of patronage systems. What this means is that likely inside states where you have minorities oppressing large groups of people and committing human rights violations, you're probably going to have unrepresentative leaderships which have not been vastly elected by the majority. However, the damages of withdrawing aid are done to the entire population at large and are not confined to the state elites. Consequently, what you do when you withdraw aid is end up frequently punishing unrepresentative dictatorial or democratic regimes for the punishing the people of the regimes for the actions of the select few who frequently been elected through undemocratic processes. Consequently, we think that when it comes to moral questions, there is no bigger harm than hurting hundreds of millions of people for the actions of people who've been elected by extremely unrepresentative democracies. They're not creating change, they're not accounting for the many people starving to death, and their own moral question isn't as absolute as they try to paint it up. Very proud to oppose.
Opening opposition's case rests on two premises. The first is that Western liberal democracies have the ability to impose conditions on the states that receive aid. The second is that even if they didn't, these states actually do good things with the aid that is provided to them rather than using that aid to oppress those people. I want to take down both premises. So 3 things in this speech. 1, why countries are now going to commit fewer human rights abuses because they need the aid that is given to them. Surprising argument that wasn't made by opening government. Second, why, even if they don't have an incentive to commit fewer human rights abuses, they will not have the ability to commit human rights abuses because of lack of money. And third, just lots of extraneous pieces of rebuttal to opening opposition. First argument, why countries have an incentive to commit fewer human rights abuses? 5 reasons. The first, the government often needs to pay off the military in their state in order to oppress their own people. Aha, opening opposition very cleverly tries to exclude military from this debate. 2 reasons why you can't mech that out, guys. The first reason is because governments often give military money to their civilian budget. So things like pensions for army veterans, right? Things such as military officers within the civilian government who get fat paychecks, right? Things such as allocating money to industrial complexes owned by army officials, right? Those are ways in which you pay off the military leaders in your state that then in return oppress your people, right? The second reason you can't do that is because some countries you give aid to are run by armies. So what is otherwise the civilian budget is technically paying every military official. I asked them, what about Egypt? His response is, no military purposes. But the country is run by the military, right? So you can't exclude that. Second reason why they have an incentive to commit fewer human rights abuses, because they need money to pay off other politicians, right? Opening opposition is correct to identify that often developing countries work in a patronage political system, where like Nawaz Sharif needs to pay off lots of other groups and factions within his party and the country in order to keep in power. He needs support of other elites. If the aid just stops coming in, he doesn't have the ability to pay them, so they don't support him anymore. Third reason, often there just is a deficit of money to balance your budget in the country, right? You promise to spend X amount of money in a particular given budgetary year, but you just can't meet that promise because you don't have enough money. That's why aid is so important, right? That's what Pakistan does with the US aid that is given to it, where it balances out its books annually. Now it no longer has that ability to give out everything it promises. Why is that crucial? 1, because of the public promises it has made for re-election incentives, but secondly, often budgetary promises are things like, we'll give X amount of money to sin so they can, in order to pander to them, right? In order to keep them happy, in order to keep all groups in their place. Now when you don't give them that amount of money, they're going to be like, why do we need to support you? Why do we acquiesce to your rule? 4th reason, often you need to pay off rebel groups or secessionist groups within your country in order to not protest against you. So think about Balochistan Liberation Army. If you if you just threw a lot of money at Balochistan, if you actually tried to improve their standard of living, a lot of their problems would go away. A lot of the reasons for them protesting would go away, right? Certain countries, what they do is they often have a budgetary aid that comes in and they pay off certain rebel groups to not protest against them. At the point which Western liberal democracies say, we're not going to give you like $10 billion a year or like even $2 billion a year, which often through currency exchanges becomes a lot of money in the Middle East or South Asia or in Africa. What that ends up meaning is that the government doesn't have the ability to pay off oppositional rebel groups around the country. That means certain groups who are armed often have the ability to fight against you. 5th, and we're going to take opening opposition on a higher burden. We're going to say even humanitarian aid should not be given. Often because of things like disasters when they occur, right? Or things like famine, you just do not have the immediate cash to alleviate suffering of people. Imagine what happens if an earthquake occurs and you just do not have the money to pay off people, right? Okay. You are going to want to curtail the human rights abuses that you commit in order to get the money to be re-elected, not be defamed in country by not being able to handle a disaster relief operation. Second argument, even if you don't have any of these incentives, having less money means you commit fewer human rights abuses. 6 reasons. 1, you just don't have enough money to pay off the police. Even if you exclude military, you can't pay off the police to kidnap journalists, oppress politicians, torture people. Second, often countries like Iraq or even Pakistan set up intelligence states, right? Where they pay off intelligence agencies to work for them. That means keeping track on all oppositions, underground movements, right? Things like picking up opposition leaders and journalists and torturing them in state. That requires like fattening the pockets of the people you rely on for daily operations. You don't have that money anymore, right? Third, you often have private gangs. Bhutto could set up the FSF in his time because he had the money coming in from outside to be able to pay off hooligans. Fourth, you can't pay off the judiciary to let you off in cases, right? Fifth, you can't pay off victims of families you have murdered, right, who are going to now actively protest against you. They say, China, Russia. 3 reasons why that's not enough. 1, China and Russia cannot pay, they just do not have enough money, right, to pay off everyone that the US or the EU pays money to. Second reason, not every state is strategically important to China and Russia. Why are they going to give money, I don't know, Mozambique, for instance, right? Like, no reason for that to happen. Third, often China and Russia require you to improve your security situation so they can reap economic benefits. That's still a fucking fantastic condition for these countries to impose. Before I go on, Harish.
So how do you think development aid is as a proportion of Pakistan's budget?
I think it's quite significant. I think majority of the money that goes to the military in Pakistan actually comes from the US. I think a significant portion of the money that goes to Sisi's government comes from the US. I think the $50 billion that the US has paid to Israel over the past 2 decades is a significant amount of money. Sure, you're not going to get rid of everything, but the sudden drop requires governments to realign their balance books, which means some groups have to be ignored. That's a huge pressure point that opposition needs to contend with. A couple of extraneous pieces of rebuttal. They rely on governments doing good things for their people with the aid. Reason number 1, they spend the money on all the other shit I just talked about. Reason number 2, they say Western liberal democracies will impose strings. The US hates Pakistan, right? But the reason they can't do anything is because they need us in Afghanistan and to not flare up tensions with India. Countries give aid to countries which they have strategic interests in. Even if you don't follow the strings they've attached, you can't just withdraw aid completely because you need them for regional influence, right? That's why Pakistan, US just can't say, Pakistan, screw you, because they know Pakistan's gonna become even more problematic in Afghanistan. Third, even if they spend money, developing countries trying to spend money on white elephant projects. What did Metro Bus ever do for the poor of Pakistan, right? Nothing. But that's what government tends to spend the developmental aid budget on because it looks fancy and it's easy to win media points and attract people on your side, right? Those are 3 key reasons why developed countries do not have any ability to moderate what these states spend their money on. But lastly, they're just really damn corrupt, so they have an incentive of lining their own pockets. Proud to propose. We win this.
It tells us liberal states like the United States, which upholds human rights in cases like Guantanamo Bay with African Americans, is being hypocritical. I am okay with being hypocritical if the alternative is that your actions perpetuate greater evil. It is not simply the fact that you fund things which will happen anyway, it's that you cause more problems. That was our extension, and that's what the previous speaker did not engage with. What do I want to do about this speech? 3 things. 1, why we think there are strategic priorities beyond just the secession of human rights. 2, why you end up with more human rights abuses as a result. Just 1 note. A lot of what we hear from the government in this debate is really about the modality of how you end up giving aid. Do you give it government to government? Well, you could give it through NGOs. Could you have conditional aid in that way opening opposition says? Which closing government respond to by saying, but states won't listen to their conditions. But for some reason, they're still happy to respond to this model where you'll give any aid to a country like Egypt. Probably not very likely. So I do want to note that most of what they're talking about is about the modality of how you give aid, not about aid per se. So that's the first thing which is worth noting. Let's even say their worst case scenario, our worst case scenario, that you're going to give aid, and it might even end up with a military dictatorship. Why are we okay with that? The first thing I want to note is there are priorities. There are things which may be more important than preventing human rights abuses in their best case of the world. Look at the example of Egypt. What would happen if you had the Al-Sisi government starved of cash? Well, we don't need to talk about that in detail because we hear about that in extension. All the kinds of problems which could exist. You could end up with them being unable to suppress opposition groups. You could end up with a government collapsing. You could end up when you couldn't buy off other kinds of rebel groups. And that is catastrophic. That is when you end up with more violence. That is where you end up with more terrorism, killing far more people than on their side of the world. Their only implicit response is, well, don't worry, governments will change. The thing is, sometimes I don't want these governments to change. Sometimes I want these governments rather to be dictatorial. Sometimes I want them to actually suppress some human rights because that leads to the secession of some of these harms. That may not be the best thing in the world, but that is simply better than the status quo when you can end up with total chaos and total anarchy. So that's the first thing we want to say. As we said in our extension, I got no response. But secondly, let's talk about changing of these governments and human rights abuses. So implicitly, I think most of the government wants to end human rights abuses, particularly of minority groups. I don't think that happens, and indeed I think they get worse. Why is this the case? So what would the justifications we hear implicitly from that side of the house as to why you end up with an end of human rights abuses. The first one of these, or the biggest one, is you need money. So we note money is fungible. They say, yes, money is fungible. Good. They concede our argument. The point is this simple, which is, yes, military aid might be important and budgetary aid is important. For most countries, it's actually not a huge amount of their budget. Yes, you might have 50 billion to Israel, but you know what? The Israeli economy is pretty damn big, and there's a lot of other sources of money as well. Tax revenue. Many countries have things like oils or minerals. That is the money you use for all the kinds of things which Assad is talking about. So that's what you use to pay off the military. That's what you use to pay off the police. Why? Because those are your priorities. What do you cut? You cut things like development. That is the most likely scenario in their side of the house. Why exactly does that matter? Because then they're left with electoral incentives, implicitly or explicitly. But we respond to that as well. We know that when it comes to development, that's going to harm you 10, 20, 30 years down the line, not immediately. But the harms immediately, when you give up to the West, are very visceral. What are these? One, you as a leader end up looking like a Western stooge. That you look like the person who, when the West told you to do something, or your big donors told you to do something, you did it. That is not a good image for any individual to have, because you look to be the West man, not someone who's indigenous to your own country. Secondly, you also end up looking weak. I think it's important to realize that both democratic leaders or strongmen leaders actually really care about looking strong. That all invincibility, the kind of thing which you had from Mubarak, for instance, for many, many years, was useful because it prevents people mobilizing against him because he looks to be that strong man, the Putin-type image. That is harm on their side of the house. But thirdly, and this is the important bit, that often you can get more political support in the here and now by abusing more human rights than you did before. Why is that the case? The first thing I want to question is why exactly do you commit human rights abuses? But first, go ahead.
This is a great extension speech, but essentially, corrupt states have to pay off multiple groups from culture debt. $2 billion less in Pakistan's budget means one group has to get less. You haven't given us any reasons why states will want to continue committing human rights abuses, but we gave you 7 reasons why states will not want to tip the balance.
We did give reasons, and I'm going to give them again right now, so I will answer what he's saying. I would note, if you believe the constituencies they talk about are so important, those are the constituencies who are going to be benefited, by the public will lose out. But why exactly is this a trade-off that the public's willing to make beyond my 20-year development analogy to begin with? Why do human rights abuses occur? I think there are at least 2 distinct reasons which we can give you. They talk a lot about capacity, which is obviously necessary, but why are you willing to commit abuses against individuals? I think there are generally 2 reasons. One, economic deprivation. That ultimately, because conditions of economic deprivation then end up being far more human rights abuses. This is both because you can see another group as directly to blame for your economic deprivation, because they might in reality steal your jobs. Look, for instance, the examples of the EU we give you. Or that can just be perceptions. There's a narrative which exists that this group is what makes your life worse. And that can be incredibly powerful, because no one wants to blame themselves for the fact they don't do well. The state doesn't want to be blamed for it, so they blame that other group. We call them the scapegoats, or they end up being the Jews in many, many years. Why exactly does that get worse as a result of this policy? Because now literally, you can say that the reason that school project in your area was cancelled is because of this group of people. This group of people, and because of these small abuses we're committing against them, and they're probably terrorists, that's a narrative, not necessarily reality in this case, is the reason why you are being screwed. That is incredibly powerful, and it's one of the reasons why you end up with more abuses, because you can directly blame them for the deprivations which you are suffering. Secondly, you end up looking more and more alien, that this group doesn't seem to be an indigenous group, but one which is foreign, literally backed by foreign powers. Take, for example, the example of the Tutsi in Rwanda, who suffered from a genocide. One of the reasons they do so, or one of the reasons there's so much hatred against them, is they look to be the group which was backed by the Belgians before. Well, that becomes worse when literally the West is backing you. They're saying, we're going to take all your money away, or a large part of money away for development if we don't help you. This is why you end up with more human rights abuses being cut. And the ability of governments to use these narratives is why they can live with the harm which is otherwise being committed, the developmental harms, and that responds to their case. And it's finally worth noting that development can make things better. Economic benefits can make things better for individuals and reduce these harms. Education can make things better. At the end of this debate, it's not simply about hypocrisy, because hypocrisy should not be as important as the prevention of harm to individuals. This prevents much greater harms, both on a general level, because there are other priorities, but even to these communities themselves. We're very happy. We're opposed.